The barren planet stretched endlessly, its cracked surface a patchwork of ochre and ash under the dim light of two distant suns. Mark adjusted his visor, wiping the sweat from his brow. The mining colony, though functional, was unforgiving. Every day was a test of survival against the planet's harsh conditions. Yet, today was different. Today, he'd stumbled upon something extraordinary. Mark was on his routine mineral survey when his scanner pinged. The signal wasn't from any known mineral deposit, it was foreign, irregular. Curiosity got the better of him. He followed the signal until he found it, a small, alien pod half buried in the cracked ground. It was sleek, metallic, and unlike anything he'd ever seen. "What the hell is this?" Mark muttered, kneeling to inspect the pod. The hatch was partially open, its edges scorched and bent as if it had crash-landed. Inside, a figure lay motionless. It wasn't human, that much was clear. The creature's skin shimmered faintly, a pale blue hue that seemed to ripple like liquid. Its limbs were elongated, its hands tipped with sharp, claw-like fingers. Despite its alien appearance, Mark noticed something oddly familiar in its posture. It looked vulnerable. "You alive in there?" Mark asked, his voice cautious. The alien stirred, its eyes fluttering open. They were a piercing shade of violet, filled with an intensity that made Mark's skin prickle. The creature's gaze locked onto him, and for a moment, neither moved. "Human," the alien rasped, its voice echoing unnaturally. "Why do you linger?" "Leave." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Not exactly a warm thank you for finding you half dead." The alien's expression twisted into what Mark assumed was a sneer. "I do not require your pity." "Pity?" "Nah," Mark replied, leaning against the pod. "I'd call it curiosity. You don't look like you're in any shape to argue, though." The alien's defiance faltered as it attempted to sit up, wincing in pain. Mark sighed. Against his better judgment, he extended a hand. "Look, I'm not leaving you here to die," Mark said firmly. "You can argue all you want after you're patched up. Deal?" The alien hesitated before reluctantly taking Mark's hand. Its touch was cold, almost metallic. Mark hauled it out of the pod and onto its feet. The creature staggered but managed to stand, leaning heavily on Mark. Back at Mark's small base, he set the alien down on a makeshift cot. The base was a cramped, utilitarian structure, filled with scavenged equipment and tools. Mark grabbed his medkit and began tending to the alien's wounds. "So, got a name?" Mark asked, trying to fill the silence. The alien's eyes flicked toward him. "Ven," it said curtly. "Well, Ven, you're lucky I found you. This planet doesn't exactly roll out the welcome mat for visitors." Ven's gaze hardened. "This is temporary, human. Once I recover, I will leave." Mark smirked. "Sure you will." As Mark worked, he noticed Ven's sharp features softened slightly, though the alien's demeanor remained guarded. There was something about Ven that intrigued Mark. It wasn't just the alien's appearance or its haughty attitude. It was the way it carried itself, as though it expected the universe to bend to its will. Yet here it was, injured and relying on a human for survival. Hours passed, and Ven began to recover. Despite its weakened state, the alien's arrogance remained intact. It eyed Mark with a mix of disdain and curiosity, as if trying to decipher the human's motives. "Why do you assist me?" Ven asked abruptly. Mark looked up from his workbench, where he was tinkering with a broken scanner. "Do I need a reason?" "Your kind is known for its unpredictability," Ven said. "Yet this, mercy is illogical." Mark chuckled. "Maybe that's what makes us human. We don't always do what makes sense." Ven seemed to mull this over, its violet eyes narrowing. Illogical, indeed. That night, as Mark prepared to sleep, his base's warning system blared. He bolted upright, checking the monitor. A large creature was approaching the base, its outline massive and menacing. "Damn it," Mark muttered. He grabbed his rifle and turned to Ven. "Stay here." Ven scoffed. "You believe I will cower while you fight?" Mark shot the alien a look. "You can barely stand." Before Ven could argue, the creature's roar echoed through the base. Mark stepped outside, his rifle at the ready. The creature was unlike anything he'd seen before, with 6 legs and jagged, armored plating. Its glowing eyes locked onto him, and it charged. Mark fired, the shots bouncing off the creature's armor. He cursed under his breath, retreating as the creature advanced. Just as it closed the distance, a sudden blast of energy hit the creature from the side. Mark turned to see Ven, standing in the doorway, one hand glowing with a strange light. "Told you to stay inside," Mark shouted, dodging the creature's swipe. "And let you perish?" Ven retorted. "Foolish." Together, they managed to drive the creature away, Mark's quick thinking and Ven's raw power proving to be a formidable combination. As the creature retreated, Mark lowered his rifle, breathing heavily. "You're full of surprises," Mark said, glancing at Ven. Ven smirked, though it looked more like a grimace. "As are you, human." Back inside, Mark patched up Ven again, shaking his head. "You're reckless. And you are stubborn," Ven shot back. "It seems we are more alike than I thought." Mark laughed, the tension easing slightly. For the first time, Ven's arrogance seemed less like superiority and more like respect. As the two settled in for the night, the base's monitor flashed. Mark frowned, checking the screen. A distress signal, not human, was coming from orbit. He glanced at Ven, whose expression turned grim. "What is it?" Mark asked. Ven hesitated. "My people are searching for me. And if they find me, they will find you." Mark's jaw tightened. "Then we'd better be ready." The distress signal pulsed ominously on the screen, its alien characters glowing faintly. Mark's mind raced as he tried to decipher its meaning. Meanwhile, Ven sat stiffly on the cot, his usual air of arrogance replaced by something Mark had not yet seen in the alien, anxiety. "What's this signal saying?" Mark asked, glancing over at Ven. Ven's violet eyes remained fixed on the monitor. "It is a locator beacon," he said slowly. "A signal to notify my kind of my position." Mark frowned. "So, they're coming to pick you up? What's the problem?" Ven's lips curled in a humorless smile. "The problem, human, is that my kind do not retrieve. They eradicate. If they find us here, your survival will be unlikely." Mark stiffened, his grip tightening on the edge of the console. "They'll just wipe us out?" "Why? Isn't saving you the point?" Ven's tone grew cold. "In their eyes, I have failed. Weakness is punished, not forgiven." Mark stared at Ven, feeling a mix of frustration and disbelief. "So you're saying your own people will kill you? That's messed up." Ven didn't respond, his gaze lowering. The silence between them thickened, broken only by the hum of the distress signal. Finally, Mark pushed himself away from the console, pacing the room. "Okay," he said, rubbing his temples. "We've got to figure something out. Can't let them just roll in here and turn this place into a crater." Ven tilted his head, studying Mark. "You speak as though you have a choice in this matter." Mark stopped pacing and glared at the alien. "There's always a choice," he said firmly. "And if you're so sure your people are coming to kill us, then you'd better help me figure out how to stop them." Ven's eyes narrowed. "You presume much, human. My kind possess technology and power far beyond your comprehension. Resistance would be futile." "Maybe," Mark said, folding his arms. "But humans are good at one thing, surviving. If you're smart, you'll stick with me. For a moment, Ven said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he stood. Though he still appeared weakened, there was a spark of determination in his eyes. Very well, Ven said. If survival is your goal, then I will assist you. For now. The hours that followed were tense. Mark and Ven worked together to fortify the base, though it quickly became clear their approaches were vastly different. Mark relied on practical, low-tech solutions, reinforcing walls with spare metal sheets, setting up traps using parts scavenged from the colony's old equipment. Ven, on the other hand, dismissed most of Mark's efforts as primitive. These crude defenses will not withstand even a fraction of their assault, Ven said, watching Mark weld a panel over a weak point in the wall. Mark sighed, lowering his welding torch. Then why don't you stop criticizing and start helping? Ven hesitated, his pride clearly warring with the situation's urgency. Finally, he relented, raising a hand. A faint, shimmering energy field appeared, flowing from his palm to cover the reinforced wall. Mark stepped back, watching in awe. What is that? Mark asked. A molecular stabilization field, Ven replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the universe. It will reinforce your rudimentary construction. Mark smirked. Thanks. I think. As they worked, Mark tried to learn more about Ven. Despite the alien's aloof demeanor, he occasionally let slip details about his species. Ven's people, known as the Chiron, were a highly advanced and militaristic race that valued strength above all else. Weakness, as Ven had said, was not tolerated. So, if you guys are so strong, why were you alone in that pod? Mark asked. Ven's expression darkened. That is none of your concern, human. Mark held up his hands in mock surrender. All right. Touchy subject. Got it. Ven's silence spoke volumes. Whatever had led to his crash, it was clearly a source of shame. By nightfall, the base was as fortified as it could be. Mark sat at the console, monitoring the distress signal while Ven rested nearby. The alien's usual arrogance had given way to exhaustion, his sharp features softened by the dim light. Hey, Mark said after a while, breaking the silence. Why do you call us unpredictable? Ven opened one eye, regarding Mark with mild curiosity. Your kind lacks consistency, he said. You display acts of great violence and destruction, yet also compassion and sacrifice. It is disorienting. Mark chuckled. Yeah, we're a bit of a mixed bag. Keeps things interesting, though, doesn't it? Ven's gaze lingered on Mark for a moment before he closed his eye again. Interesting is one word for it. The next morning, the signal changed. Mark noticed it immediately, the pulsing light had become faster, more insistent. Ven's reaction was immediate. He stood abruptly, his posture rigid. They are close, Ven said, his voice low. We do not have much time. Mark nodded, his expression grim. Then we'd better be ready. Together, they ran through their preparations. Mark double-checked the traps and weaponry, while Ven focused on enhancing the base's defenses with his energy fields. Despite the tension, there was a strange sense of camaraderie between them, a shared determination to survive. As the sun set, the first sign of the Chiron ship appeared on the horizon. It was a sleek, menacing craft that hovered silently, its dark hull gleaming under the fading light. Mark felt a chill run down his spine as he watched it approach. They're here, he said quietly. Ven stood beside him, his expression unreadable. Prepare yourself, human. This will not be easy. Mark tightened his grip on his rifle, his jaw set. Easy's overrated. The ship stopped just outside the base, its engines humming softly. A beam of light shot down from its underbelly, and a group of Chiron warriors descended. They were taller and more imposing than Ven, their armor gleaming and their weapons humming with energy. One of them stepped forward, addressing Ven in their native tongue. The words were sharp and commanding, their tone leaving no room for argument. "What are they saying?" Mark whispered. Ven's jaw tightened. "They demand my surrender." "And yours?" Mark smirked. "Yeah, that's not happening." Before Ven could respond, the lead warrior raised his weapon, pointing it directly at Mark. The gesture was clear: comply or die. "Time to show them what unpredictable really looks like," Mark said, his finger hovering over the trigger. Ven nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "For once, human, I agree." The air between Mark and Ven was charged as the Chiron warriors stood at the threshold of the fortified base. Their leader's weapon gleamed, humming faintly with a power Mark couldn't understand but instinctively feared. Mark's grip on his rifle tightened as he glanced at Ven, whose normally arrogant expression had hardened into one of cold resolve. "What now?" Mark whispered, his voice low enough that only Ven could hear. Ven's eyes flicked toward him. "Now we show them that underestimating you was their first mistake." The lead Chiron warrior spoke again in their sharp, alien tongue. Mark didn't need a translator to know it was another ultimatum. "They will attack," Ven said, his voice edged with tension. "They see us as insignificant, an easy target. Use that." Mark gave a grim nod. "Good thing humans love being underestimated." The first volley of fire erupted from the Chiron, energy blasts hammering into the reinforced walls of the base. The traps Mark had painstakingly set up sprang to life. Explosive charges hidden in the ground erupted, scattering debris and forcing the Chiron warriors to retreat momentarily. One of them fell, its armor cracked, but the others pressed forward with practiced precision. Mark ducked behind cover, his heart pounding. He aimed his rifle at an advancing Chiron and fired, the shot striking its shoulder and forcing it to stumble. Beside him, Ven raised his hand, and a shimmering wave of energy surged outward, slamming into another warrior and sending it sprawling. "Not bad," Mark said, panting as he reloaded. "Focus," Ven snapped. "They will adapt quickly." And they did. The Chiron regrouped, their movements coordinated and calculated. They spread out, flanking the base, their weapons tearing through the outer defenses. Mark's traps delayed them, but it was clear the base wouldn't hold forever. "We need a new plan," Mark shouted over the chaos. Ven's gaze darted around, assessing the situation. "Follow me." Before Mark could protest, Ven grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the rear of the base. They navigated through narrow corridors until they reached a hidden exit Mark had built as a last resort. "We cannot win this fight here," Ven said. "We must draw them into unfamiliar territory, your territory." Mark frowned but nodded. "All right. But if we're doing this, we're doing it my way." The two emerged into the desolate landscape beyond the base, the harsh winds biting at their faces. Mark led Ven toward a rocky outcrop he had scouted during his mining expeditions. The terrain was uneven and filled with crevices and hidden pitfalls, a natural maze that Mark had mapped in his head. "This place is a death trap if you don't know your way around," Mark said, crouching behind a boulder. "Stay close, and don't do anything stupid." Ven raised an eyebrow. "Your definition of stupid differs from mine, but I will comply." They didn't have to wait long. The Chiron warriors pursued them relentlessly, their sharp armor glinting as they moved with an almost predatory grace. Mark's traps had thinned their numbers, but there were still enough of them to be a serious threat. Mark gestured for Ven to follow him as he led the Chiron into the heart of the rocky terrain. He activated a series of makeshift devices he'd planted earlier, mines disguised as loose rocks, snares that triggered collapses, and directional explosives designed to create confusion and chaos. Each trap slowed the Chiron's advance, forcing them to split up and lose their formation. Impressive, Ven admitted as one of the Chiron fell into a concealed pit, its growls of frustration echoing through the canyon. Your ingenuity rivals their strength. Mark smirked. Thanks, but flattery won't save us. We're still outnumbered. As the chase continued, Mark and Ven reached a narrow gorge. The walls were steep, and the only way through was a precarious path barely wide enough for one person. Mark motioned for Ven to stop. This is it, Mark said. We bottleneck them here. Ven frowned. And if they overwhelm us? Then we make sure they regret it, Mark replied, setting up his rifle. The Chiron arrived moments later, their leader at the forefront. The narrow path forced them to approach single file, neutralizing their numbers' advantage. Mark took aim and fired, his shots precise. Beside him, Ven unleashed waves of energy that sent the Chiron reeling. The fight was brutal and unrelenting. Mark's muscles burned as he reloaded again and again, his ears ringing from the deafening blasts. Ven fought with a ferocity Mark hadn't seen before, his usual arrogance replaced by sheer determination. Finally, the tide began to turn. The Chiron leader, now the last of his squad, staggered forward, his armor cracked and his weapon faltering. He glared at Ven, snarling something in their native tongue. Ven's expression hardened. He accuses me of betrayal, Ven said, his voice low. Of siding with the enemy. Mark raised an eyebrow. Are you? Ven didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, his energy coalescing into a concentrated sphere. The Chiron leader raised his weapon, but Ven was faster. With a final, devastating blast, the leader fell, his body collapsing in a heap. Mark lowered his rifle, breathing heavily. Guess that answers my question. Ven turned to him, his expression unreadable. You are unpredictable, he said after a moment. But effective. Mark chuckled, slumping against the rocky wall. I'll take that as a compliment. As the dust settled, the two stood in the aftermath of the battle. The Chiron ship loomed in the distance, its engines humming softly. Mark knew they couldn't stay here for long. More Chiron could come, and the base was no longer safe. So, what now? Mark asked, glancing at Ven. Ven's gaze was distant, his violet eyes reflecting the faint light of the ship. Now we prepare for what comes next. Mark sighed, already dreading what that might entail. But as he looked at Ven, he realized something had shifted. The alien who had once dismissed him as insignificant now stood beside him as an equal, if not an ally. For now, that would have to be enough. Continue Part 3 of 1000 Words. The adrenaline from the battle still coursed through Mark's veins as he and Ven retreated to a safer location. The rocky outcrop had provided them with a temporary victory, but it was far from a permanent solution. They needed a plan, and more importantly, they needed to understand each other's strengths if they had any chance of surviving the next encounter. Mark set up a small campfire in a sheltered area, using scavenged materials from his pack. The flames flickered weakly against the darkness, casting shadows that danced across the jagged rocks. Ven sat opposite him, silent and contemplative. All right, Mark began, breaking the silence. We can't keep running like this. We need a better strategy. Ven's violet eyes met Mark's. Agreed. But your tactics, while effective in this skirmish, will not suffice against a larger force. Mark leaned back, his expression thoughtful. Then we need to combine your tech with my knowledge of this terrain. We've got to hit them where they least expect it. Ven's brow furrowed. You suggest a partnership? Call it what you want, Mark said with a shrug. I'm just saying we work better together than apart. You saw that out there. Ven was silent for a moment, then gave a slight nod. Very well. But understand this, human, I will not tolerate failure. Mark smirked. Good thing I don't plan on failing. Over the next few days, they worked tirelessly to prepare for the inevitable return of the Chiron. Ven used his energy manipulation to fortify their defenses, creating barriers that shimmered faintly in the light. Mark, meanwhile, focused on crafting new traps and honing their strategy. The process was not without its challenges. They often clashed over methods, their vastly different perspectives leading to heated arguments. You can't just rely on brute force, Mark snapped during one such disagreement. These guys are smart. We need to outthink them. And your primitive tools are the answer? Ven retorted. They are barely adequate. Mark threw up his hands in frustration. Look, I get it. Your tech is light years ahead of ours. But sometimes the simplest solutions work best. Trust me on this. Reluctantly, Ven conceded. Very well. Show me these simple solutions. Despite their differences, a mutual respect began to form. Mark was surprised to find that Ven's aloof demeanor occasionally cracked, revealing glimpses of humor and even admiration. Similarly, Ven seemed to grow more intrigued by Mark's resourcefulness and determination. One evening, as they reviewed their plans, Ven spoke unexpectedly. You're kind, you adapt quickly. It is both your greatest strength and your greatest unpredictability. Mark glanced at him, surprised. Was that a compliment? Ven's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. An observation. Mark chuckled. I'll take it. The bond between them was tested when another Chiron patrol arrived, scouting the area for their fallen comrades. This time, Mark and Ven were ready. Using a combination of Mark's traps and Ven's energy manipulation, they ambushed the patrol, taking them out swiftly and efficiently. After the skirmish, as they surveyed the aftermath, Ven turned to Mark. Perhaps there is merit in your unpredictability after all. Mark grinned. Told you so. But as the days wore on, the looming threat of a larger Chiron force weighed heavily on them. Both knew that their fragile alliance would be tested in ways neither could fully anticipate. The air inside Relk's quarters was heavy with a mixture of tension and curiosity. Kate, perched on a raised platform near the viewport, watched as Relk fidgeted with a set of holographic controls. She had noticed something over the past several days. Relk's movements were not as sure as they had once been. He second-guessed his commands and hesitated before making decisions. It was a far cry from the confident, unyielding figure she'd first encountered when she crash-landed on this world. The shift in their dynamic was subtle, but undeniable. She had planted the seeds, and now she saw the first signs of growth. Relk, Kate said, her tone calm and even. You've been at that console for an hour now. Something on your mind? The alien glanced up, his dark eyes narrowing slightly. Human, I don't require your input. Kate raised an eyebrow. Funny. That's not the impression you gave when you asked for my advice yesterday. Relk's hand froze above the console. That was different. Sure it was, she replied with a slight smirk. But let me guess. You're trying to figure out how to reroute power to the external sensors without triggering a system-wide reboot. He shot her a suspicious look. How would you know that? Kate shrugged. Because I've seen the pattern. Every time you get reports of energy anomalies in the outer zones, you come here and poke at that console for ages. I don't think you've figured it out yet. Relk's lips pressed into a thin line. He hated feeling predictable. Yet, in the silence that followed, it became clear that she'd hit the mark. Kate let the pause linger before adding, Look, I could help, but only if you admit you need it. For a long moment, Relk said nothing. Then, with a reluctant grumble, he stepped back from the console. Fine. If you know so much, human, then prove it. Kate slid off the platform and crossed the room. She approached the console, carefully reading the alien symbols and patterns on the holographic interface. Over the past weeks, she had quietly taught herself enough to recognize the key commands. With a few deft movements, she rerouted the power flow. The console's warning lights blinked out, replaced by a steady green glow. "There," she said, stepping back. "No reboot needed." Relk's eyes flicked between her and the console. He looked almost impressed, though he quickly masked it with a grunt. "Adequate." Kate knew better than to press for praise. Instead, she walked back to her seat and settled in. "You're welcome." Over the next few days, Kate's role as Relk's unofficial advisor grew. She didn't make any grand gestures, nor did she outright demand authority. Instead, she offered small, practical solutions, solving technical problems, suggesting strategic changes, and subtly guiding Relk's decisions. Each time, she made it seem like Relk had arrived at the conclusion himself. She didn't need to seize control, she let Relk hand it over bit by bit. One evening, as Relk prepared to meet with his peers, Kate noticed him hesitating in front of the mirror-like panel in his quarters. His usually sharp and polished appearance seemed off. The polished armor plates were still intact, the markings still bold, but there was a tension in his stance that suggested uncertainty. "Something wrong?" Kate asked, leaning casually against the wall. Relk glanced at her through the reflection. "Why do you ask?" "You look like you're about to march into a tribunal," she replied, folding her arms. "A little nervous?" Relk scoffed. "I am not nervous." Sure, Kate said, walking closer. "But if you're worried about how your colleagues might react to our recent collaboration, I have a suggestion." Relk turned to face her fully. "Speak." "Frame it as a strategic advantage," she said simply. "Say that you've been testing human ingenuity to strengthen your own knowledge base. Make it sound like you're exploiting me, not the other way around." Relk's eyes narrowed. "You presume much, human." Kate shrugged. "Maybe. But they'll buy it, won't they?" The alien didn't respond right away. He studied her, perhaps weighing the risk of trusting her suggestion against the risk of going in unprepared. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "I'll consider it." Hours later, Relk returned from the meeting looking surprisingly calm. Kate didn't ask what had happened, she didn't need to. His less rigid posture and the absence of reprimands from his superiors were evidence enough. It was another small victory. As the days turned into weeks, Relk's reliance on Kate became increasingly apparent. She had access to resources now, materials, data terminals, even limited movement within the compound. Relk justified it by claiming it was all part of his study of human resourcefulness. But Kate knew the truth. She had maneuvered herself into a position where she could influence decisions without making it obvious. She wasn't just a captive anymore, she was a strategist. One day, as they worked together to optimize the compound's energy distribution network, Kate decided to test just how loyal Relk had become. She brought up a delicate topic, the mounting tension between Relk and another high-ranking member of his species. This individual, Thrix, had grown suspicious of Relk's recent choices and had begun questioning his judgment. "Thrix isn't just suspicious of you," Kate said as she adjusted a control panel. "He's jealous. He sees your successes as a threat." Relk stiffened. "Thrix is a fool." "Maybe," Kate replied, "but a fool with influence can still cause problems. If he were to bring your leadership into question, how would you respond?" Relk hesitated. "I would defend my position." "With words?" Kate pressed. "Or with action?" Relk's jaw tightened. "You suggest I provoke him?" "No," Kate said calmly. "I suggest you show him why you're indispensable. Demonstrate the strength of your leadership. Show him that you can outmaneuver him at every turn." Relk looked at her, a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze. But once again, he took her advice. Over the next week, Relk executed a series of moves that reinforced his standing. He presented new strategies, ideas that Kate had carefully planted in his mind, at key meetings. He gained the support of others who had previously been neutral, leaving Thrix isolated and less of a threat. By the time Thrix tried to challenge Relk directly, it was too late. Relk had consolidated his position, and his rivals had no choice but to acknowledge his growing strength. What none of them realized was that it was Kate's ideas, whispered in the background, that had paved the way. As Relk's confidence grew, so did his loyalty to Kate. He no longer treated her as a mere human captive. She was his advisor, his strategist, and in a strange way, his partner. But Kate never let him forget who held the true power. She remained the one guiding their path, ensuring that every move served her long-term goal, survival and control. The first sign of trouble came through a high-pitched alarm echoing down the metallic corridors of the compound. Kate, engrossed in her careful dissection of a malfunctioning energy regulator, looked up sharply as red lights strobed along the walls. A moment later, Relk burst into the room. His usually composed expression was clouded with something Kate rarely saw, urgency. "Something's wrong," he said, his deep voice tense. "The outer sensors are picking up unusual energy signatures. Too large and too erratic to be natural phenomena." Kate stood and brushed the dust from her hands. "What kind of energy signatures?" Relk pulled up a holographic display and gestured to a set of fluctuating waveforms. Kate didn't need to fully understand the alien metrics to know that these signals spelled danger. "It's a fleet," Relk confirmed. "Unknown configuration, and they're not broadcasting any identification. They're heading straight for us." "Pirates?" Kate asked. "Possibly. Or worse, raiders from the fringe systems." Relk turned toward the door, already giving orders to a nearby subordinate. "Increase the perimeter defenses. Prepare the interceptor drones. And tell the command center to scramble all available troops." Kate watched him for a moment. This was the first time she'd seen Relk truly rattled. The realization was unsettling, but also revealing. If these attackers could shake him, they must be a significant threat. "Wait," Kate called after him. Relk paused, his eyes narrowing at her. "You'll need a plan." Relk bristled. "I have a plan: repel the invaders." "What else is there?" "That's not a plan," she countered. "That's a reaction. If you're caught off guard and they have superior numbers, you won't win by brute force. You need a strategy." Relk hesitated, clearly weighing her words. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew she was right. "What do you suggest?" Kate approached the holographic display and examined the waveforms again. She pointed to the gaps in the data. "Their movements aren't steady. If these readings are correct, they're pausing and shifting formation frequently. That suggests either indecision or internal communication issues. They might not be as organized as they look." Relk frowned. "How does that help us?" "Exploit their disarray," Kate said. "Use their hesitation against them. If we can lure part of their fleet into a bottleneck, say, between the orbital debris fields and near the planet's north pole, we can isolate and eliminate them piecemeal. Force them to split their attention, and they'll be easier to handle." Relk's brow furrowed. "And if they see through it?" Kate smiled faintly. "They won't if we make the bait irresistible. Offer up a weak point, something they can't resist attacking, and then trap them when they commit." Relk stared at her for a moment before nodding slowly. "You're certain this will work?" "No plan is foolproof," she replied. "But it's better than going in blind. Trust me." Relk's gaze lingered on her before he turned back to his subordinates. "Adjust the defense grid. Redirect power to the northern sector. Begin preparations for the bait strategy immediately." Kate knew she couldn't relax yet. Just because Relk had taken her advice didn't mean the threat was gone. She joined him in the command center as the compound braced for the impending assault. Holographic maps displayed the attackers' approach in real time, their numbers becoming increasingly clear. It wasn't a small raiding party, it was an entire fleet, well-armed and clearly intent on more than just a quick hit and run. The hours stretched on as they finalized their defenses. Kate worked alongside Relk and his crew, reviewing sensor data and fine-tuning the trap. Relk's subordinates were wary of her involvement, but they didn't challenge her, not with Relk's tacit approval shielding her. In that tense room, Kate realized just how far she'd come from being a captive. She was no longer a prisoner in chains, she was a critical voice in their survival. The first exchange of fire came without warning. The attackers launched a volley of plasma torpedoes, illuminating the night sky above the compound. The defensive shields flared as they absorbed the brunt of the impact. Alarms blared, and Relk barked orders to his troops. "Hold the line," he roared. "Do not let them breach the perimeter." Kate stood at his side, analyzing the incoming data streams. "They're focusing on the eastern quadrant. That's where we should concentrate the decoy signals." Relk nodded sharply. "Make it so." The trap unfolded as planned. A series of carefully timed power surges in the northern debris field created the illusion of a critical weak point. The attackers took the bait, diverting a significant portion of their fleet toward the false target. As they moved in, automated mines hidden among the debris activated, tearing through their ranks. Meanwhile, the compound's defensive batteries, now freed from defending the eastern quadrant, unleashed a barrage on the remaining ships. It was a brutal, chaotic engagement. Explosions lit up the sky, and the sound of distant gunfire echoed through the corridors. Kate stayed by the tactical console, feeding Relk real-time updates. Every step of the plan hinged on precision, any miscalculation could have been disastrous. As the battle raged on, Relk's composure returned. The initial panic was gone, replaced by the same cold determination that had defined him before this crisis. He moved with purpose, issuing commands and adjusting tactics on the fly. And, though he never said it outright, he relied on Kate's insights at every turn. Hours later, as the last of the attackers' ships retreated, a heavy silence fell over the command center. The strobing red lights dimmed, replaced by the steady glow of normal operations. The compound had held. Relk let out a long breath, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. "They're retreating," he said, almost in disbelief. Kate nodded, a faint smile playing at her lips. "I told you the plan would work." Relk glanced at her. "You did." He didn't offer more, but that single acknowledgement spoke volumes. In that moment, Kate knew she had earned more than his grudging respect. She had proven her value in a crisis, solidifying her place in their uneasy partnership. The aftermath was far from easy. The compound's defenses were damaged, and resources were stretched thin. Relk's peers would undoubtedly question the wisdom of his strategy, but Kate was ready for that. Together, they had weathered a storm that could have destroyed them. The external threat had been neutralized, but the challenges ahead remained daunting. Still, as the compound returned to a tense normalcy, Kate knew one thing for certain: she and Relk had crossed a threshold. Their dynamic had changed once again. She was no longer just a strategist or an advisor. She was a survivor, and now, more than ever, Relk was bound to her. Not just by circumstance, but by trust, and maybe even something more. Kate didn't need to say it out loud. The new reality was clear: they had become a team. The dust of battle settled, but the scars it left behind lingered, some visible, etched into the walls of the compound, and others hidden, carried within those who survived. The once unyielding divide between captor and captive had eroded, replaced by a fragile alliance built on necessity, strategy, and reluctant respect. Kate, no longer a prisoner in the truest sense, found herself in uncharted territory. Her influence over Relk was now undeniable, but it came with a price. Trust, after all, was a double-edged sword. Relk sat at the command console, scanning the remains of the enemy fleet's signal trails. The holographic display cast sharp, blue-tinged light across his angular features. Kate stood nearby, arms crossed, watching him with a critical eye. The tension of their earlier battles still hung in the air, but it no longer defined them. "We drove them off," Relk said, his voice carrying a mixture of exhaustion and quiet pride. "But they'll regroup. It's only a matter of time." "Then we need to be ready," Kate replied. Her tone was matter-of-fact, but not harsh. "We both know the attack wasn't random. They came for something, and now that they know we're a target, they'll come back in greater numbers." Relk glanced at her, and for once, he didn't bristle at her suggestion. "You're right. Preparing for the next strike must be our priority." The word "our" wasn't lost on Kate. She knew how far they had come, how far he had come, to even consider her a partner in this endeavor. But she also understood that this new status quo was tenuous. Relk's people would be watching closely. Any misstep could undo the delicate balance they'd achieved. Over the following weeks, Kate and Relk worked side by side to rebuild their defenses. Supplies were rationed carefully, and every repair was scrutinized to ensure no resources were wasted. The compound's surviving inhabitants, wary of Kate's presence, gradually adjusted to her involvement. She never sought their approval, she simply did her part, proving her value through actions rather than words. Relk, for his part, began to rely on her more openly. He consulted her on matters of strategy and logistics, acknowledging that her insights had saved them before and could do so again. It wasn't an admission of weakness, it was a calculated decision. Relk understood that she brought something to the table that he lacked, an outsider's perspective, unclouded by the rigid hierarchy of his people. In return, Kate learned more about Relk's society and their underlying motivations. She came to understand the pressures he faced, not just from external threats, but from within. His position was far from secure, and every decision he made was scrutinized by rivals eager to see him fail. Kate used this knowledge carefully, never pushing too hard, but always positioning herself as the ally he could trust. One evening, as they reviewed the compound's power distribution network, Kate decided to broach a subject she had avoided until now. "Relk," she began, her voice calm, "we need to consider more than just defense. We need a long-term plan." He looked up from the holographic interface, his expression guarded. "What kind of plan?" "A way out," she said. "If another fleet comes and we can't hold them off, this compound won't be enough. We need contingencies, escape routes, fallback positions, alternative supply lines." Relk leaned back, his sharp eyes narrowing. "You mean retreat?" "Not retreat," Kate said carefully. "Strategic repositioning. Survival isn't just about fighting, it's about knowing when to move." Relk was silent for a long moment, clearly weighing her words. Finally, he nodded. "I'll consider it. But if we do this, it must be on my terms. My people must see it as a calculated choice, not an act of desperation." "Agreed," Kate said. "We'll make it look like a maneuver, not a retreat." The seeds of their new strategy took root. Kate and Relk began mapping out potential safe havens, uninhabited planets, hidden asteroid outposts, and abandoned research stations. They compiled contingency plans, assigning tasks to trusted subordinates and securing the necessary supplies. Every step was deliberate, designed to ensure that if the worst happened, they wouldn't be caught off guard. Throughout this process, their partnership solidified. Relk, though still proud and often stubborn, began to defer to Kate's judgment in matters where her experience as a human proved advantageous. She, in turn, learned to navigate his culture's nuances, understanding when to push and when to step back. Together, they formed a balance that neither could have achieved alone. But this alliance didn't come without challenges. There were moments of tension, disagreements over priorities, clashes of personality, but they never let these conflicts fester. Each time, they found common ground, knowing that their survival depended on their ability to work together. As the months passed, the compound grew stronger, not just in fortifications, but in resilience. Kate's influence extended beyond Relk. Others began to see her as a valuable asset rather than an outsider. Slowly, grudgingly, she earned their respect. And while some still viewed her with suspicion, they couldn't deny the results. Relk, once a staunch believer in his own superiority, now found himself reconsidering long-held assumptions. He didn't say it aloud, but Kate could see the change in his demeanor. He listened more, argued less, and even began to ask her opinion before making critical decisions. It wasn't submission, it was evolution. For Kate, the transformation was equally profound. She had started as a stranded human, fighting to survive in an alien world. Now, she was a key figure in the survival of an entire community. Her captivity had turned into collaboration, and her role as a strategist and leader had given her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Their final test came when a small, scouting force from the same fleet that had attacked them months earlier reappeared. This time, Kate and Relk were ready. The new defenses, carefully planned escape routes, and strategic maneuvers all came into play. The attackers were driven off swiftly and decisively, proving that their preparations had paid off. As the last enemy vessel disappeared from the sensors, Kate and Relk stood in the command center, watching the holographic display fade to a calm blue. They exchanged a look, not of celebration, but of mutual understanding. They had survived again, but the journey was far from over. "Good work," Relk said, his tone unusually sincere. Kate nodded. "You too. But this is just one step." Relk smiled faintly, a rare expression for him. "Then we'll take the next step. Together." Kate smiled back. Together. And so, they moved forward, not as captor and captive, but as two beings who had found strength in each other's differences. The future remained uncertain, but one thing was clear: they were no longer merely surviving. They were building something stronger, something that would endure.